Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening wherever you are, and welcome to the latest episode of the My Coach Ben podcast. So, two things before we get into it. Firstly, thanks for all the comments, feedback, and the response from the last episode. And it's a very important topic, this diversity and inclusion, and it's something which a lot of people are very passionate about. A lot of people are pretty concerned about, and of course, yes, it's something which affects us all in the workplace, especially in modern times. So thanks for all the input there. And the second point, of course, I'm on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and of course like and subscribe to the podcast here on the channel, and let's continue to grow the community. Thanks to everyone that's subscribed so far, and to those that haven't, press the subscribe button and the notification bell and keep in touch with the latest content. The Oxford English Dictionary defines culture as the ideas, customs and social behaviour of a particular people or society. And of course, in terms of corporate culture, we can just replace society with corporate or organisation. Following on from the last topic, which was diversity and inclusion, this time round we're going to be looking at an equally interesting topic, and that is of culture. But we're not just talking about West Indian culture versus British or German culture, we're talking about corporate culture. Organisational culture, or let's keep it simple and say corporate culture. What is it? As you know, I'm a stickler for a definition. The phrase corporate culture, or organisational culture as it actually was in a book that was published in 1951 by a psychoanalyst called Dr. Elliot Jacques. So in brief, the book actually explores the relationship between the management and, let's say, the workers. However, as part of the study, one of the topics that was looked at or explored was how newcomers would be integrated into the company, and let's say the habits that they would have to learn in order to be accepted. And of course, this is what we would all recognise as corporate culture. We can call this organisational culture, but for the sake of simplicity, we're going to call this corporate culture in this discussion. So what does corporate culture look like in the corporation or the organisation, in the workplace? Well, two words you can associate with corporate culture are essentially beliefs and values. And from the coaching perspective, there are two questions that come to mind. What constitutes the beliefs of a company, and what constitutes the values of a company? So beliefs are essentially the acceptance of or faith in a certain topic or a certain person. And so if we answer these two questions, then we get an idea of how we can describe our own corporate culture. So firstly, let's look at beliefs. So for example, I work in the energy industry, and for those that don't know the energy industry, for the last 20 years it's gone through enormous change. And now, with the environmental concerns over the last few years, most, or if not all, energy companies are having to rethink the way they go about their business. And for many, this is expressed directly through their corporate culture. So for instance, if we're talking about addressing environmental concerns, different companies will have different approaches. So let's say you could be looking at wind energy, you could be looking at solar energy, you could be looking at the topic of batteries, LNG, moving gas from one place to another. Or of course getting efficiencies from existing methods of generation such as coal and natural gas. So let's say on one hand you can have a company that wants to have a high risk approach, all in, throw all the capital they can at whatever endeavours they can, and hopefully, or all things considered, after some hopefully extensive research and calculations, they can reach a point where they can say that they have the environmental stance that they would like. So if we use our energy business as the example, the values of the company, well, these are going to be how they go about executing the strategies in order to improve their environmental position. Because remember, there's no right or wrong answer here. is simply about ideas and beliefs. And then we come on to values. And a company's values are basically the principles and the judgments that the company makes in how they interpret the business, how they interpret the world around them, how they treat their staff even. These are the values of a company. Essentially, the option that the company is going to use depends on their belief. So what they believe is going to be the best way forward. Or alternatively, you have another company who values a more patient approach, and they're just going to wait, continue as things are, and see how the technologies and the markets develop, and then they can make a judgment as to which way they can go forward. So this essentially is summing up the company's values. And of course, if we look at both of these, then we can determine the company's culture. But what we also have to bear in mind is how the company is going to deploy the resources to achieve those ends. Again, this has a lot to do with the company's culture. Is it a conservative company? Is it a company which is much more agile, let's say, to use a common expression? So are they much more flexible in their approach? All these are to do with the company's culture. So how do we go about establishing a corporate culture? And more importantly, what kind of corporate culture? And it's fair to say that the culture of most companies are mirrored by their leadership. If we take two examples, we can look at Apple. Now, Apple traditionally, of course, and historically, we had Steve Jobs, the late Steve Jobs, who was I don't think he was the founder, but certainly bought the company from a struggling business in the late 60s and 70s to the global name that we know today. Steve Jobs, of course, was someone, he never really dressed like this. He always had on a black crew neck, and he made his presentations in jeans and what have you. And his company culture followed him. Yeah, he was very relaxed. He always used the words beautiful and what have you. And he was a very outgoing, very communicative person. And this actually translates into Apple products. Yeah, Apple products tend to be associated more with home time. When I say home time, I mean home life. Also, the creative business. Generally, they're using Apple products as opposed to the alternative, let's say Microsoft. Traditionally, Microsoft has been, much like the founder, Mr. Bill Gates, someone who was much more formal than the late Steve Jobs. And then we have an outlook or let's say a style which is much more formal. Yeah, people think of Microsoft as being much more formal, more office environment type of tools and type of approach. So of course there we have two distinct products which come really from two distinct corporate cultures, and that in turn will have a lot to do with how the leadership views diversity and inclusion, for example, how the company is going to approach reducing a carbon footprint, let's say, or looking at new ways of generating electricity, if you want to look at the energy business. So in the last episode, we looked at diversity and inclusion. Most people will agree the way a company or an organisation approaches the topic of diversity and inclusion has a lot to do with their culture. So this begs the question, what kind of corporate culture do you work in? Would you say it's a healthy corporate culture? Would you say it needs to be improved? And one thing I've come to find in my, extensive years of work, without giving away how young I am, is that the company's culture does follow the leader. And the answer to those questions will actually relate back to the leadership. And what you find is leaders of companies tend to employ people that are similar or that are going to toe their line. Yeah, even if you look at a team level, there are many teams these days where people would often say, I don't know if it's a criticism or an observation, but the team leaders tend to recruit people that are often in a similar way to themselves. Yeah, and therein you have even a team culture. But from the analysis of JAX, I think we can clearly see that culture has so much to do with the relationship between the different levels of authority in a company or an organisation. And this is key. The healthier the relationship, the better the culture is going to be. And in order to expand on the title from the latest blog entry, what is corporate culture? Is it a value or is it a vice? Of course, to be a value, the corporate culture has to allow some freedom of expression, of course, to a certain degree, freedom of creativity as well. So, for example, if you're working in an organisation where the leadership is very authoritative and conservative, what you find is that, these companies tend to be quite slow. There often tends to be, arguably, a lack of freedom and a lack of creativity as a result. Conversely, an organisation that has a fairly relaxed leader, I think you're going to find a lot more freedom. You're going to find a lot more creativity. I think you're going to find much better productivity. The people are going to be in a healthier mood. And this arguably comes directly from the corporate culture, which to a large degree comes from the leadership. And what is very important is to have the freedom to not know. And by that, I mean, it's not a problem to not know something. And of course, that builds a trust. It's not obviously a situation that you want to not know anything, of course. But when there are certain challenges that come up, it's all right not to know the answer, because frankly, when people work together, many hands make light work, as the expression goes. And this is how we come up with solutions. I'm pretty certain that a lot of people have worked in organisations which are actually the opposite, where there isn't much freedom of expression or to say that you don't know something, and much of the solutions that the company comes up with are generally dreamt up by one person. There is value in corporate culture. And when we have the opposite, then it is a vice, in both senses of the word. It's something which is going to constrain the individual and the workforce, and it's a really bad habit to get into. So let's wrap it up there. Thanks very much for joining us this week. As I say, please comment, subscribe as well. I'd be interested to hear what you think and how the corporate culture compares in your place, how that works at the moment, and whether or not you feel it's an inclusive culture, or the other side, the less progressive kind of culture, maybe a bit more conservative, which may work in certain industries. I'll be interested to hear. So again, as I say, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on Facebook. Well, follow me rather, there's only one of me, fortunately or unfortunately, however that may be. Follow me on Facebook, on Instagram and on Twitter. And until next time, peace, your Coach Ben. So of course, itchy head. And in this episode we're going to be even maybe more so than last time, week thing. And the second point, good morning, good afternoon and good evening wherever you are, and welcome to the latest episode of the My Coach Ben podcast. This week what we're going to be was called The Changing Culture of a Factory, a Study. So how do we establish a corporate culture? When I say establish a corporate culture, and that in turn will have a lot to do with how the leadership views diversity